Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into one of the most consequential splits in religious history, the Great Schism. But before swords were drawn or churches anathematized each other, the seeds of division were quietly growing in the soil of early Christianity. And they started growing early. So let me ask you something. How does a movement built on unity, peace, and brotherhood end up fractured into rival empires of faith? Let's rewind the clock, way back to the days after Emperor Constantine's famous conversion in the 4th century. Suddenly, Christianity wasn't just a persecuted cult anymore. It became the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's like a garage band being handed control of the entire government. It was unprecedented. But with imperial favor came imperial strings. The church got pulled into politics. Bishops gained status. Church decisions now had political implications. And that meant Christianity's fate became tied to regional power struggles, East versus West, Greek versus Latin, Emperor versus Pope. And then come the councils. Nicaea in 325, Chalcedon in 451. These weren't just theological potlucks. These were battlegrounds. What did it mean for Jesus to be divine? Was he of the same substance as God, or merely similar? These were questions that shaped kingdoms. And every council that was supposed to create unity ended up revealing even deeper rifts. And here's a detail people often miss. Language. The West spoke Latin, the East spoke Greek. That's not just a matter of vocabulary, it's a matter of worldview. Scripture, theology, even basic concepts started to drift apart as translations diverged and meanings shifted. Imagine trying to build a shared doctrine when you can't even agree on the meaning of the word spirit. That's where the misfires began. So by the time we reach the later centuries, the church looks unified on paper, but under the surface, it's splitting at the seams. A shared religion, sure, but increasingly, two different civilizations wearing the same cross. That's where our story begins. Now that we've laid the groundwork, let's take a closer look at the disputes that pushed this fragile unity toward a full-blown rupture. Because here's the thing, theology wasn't just a matter of faith, it became a matter of identity. Let's start with a phrase that caused a massive theological earthquake, Filioque. It's Latin for and the Son. Just 3 little words, but they sparked centuries of discord. Originally, the Nicene Creed declared that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. That's what both East and West agreed on. But over time, the Western Church began adding and the Son, so the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Now why does that matter? Because in the East, this change wasn't just a grammatical tweak. It was a theological power grab. It altered the relationship within the Trinity and implied that the West could unilaterally redefine doctrine. No council, no consensus, just done. And then there's the bread. Yes, bread. In the East, they used leavened bread for the Eucharist, bread that rises, symbolizing Christ's resurrection. In the West, they used unleavened bread, connecting it to the Passover and the purity of Christ. Different theology, different emphasis, different symbolism. But more than that, it was a way each side saw itself as holding the true tradition. When your bread becomes a battleground, you know the deeper issues are spiritual and cultural. And once again, language stoked the fire. Latin in the West, Greek in the East. These weren't just tools for communication. They were entire systems of thought. As scriptural translations diverged and key terms took on different meanings, misunderstanding flourished. Imagine 2 scholars arguing passionately for centuries, but in entirely different languages. It's not just miscommunication, it's mutual alienation. So by this point, we're not just talking about doctrinal disagreements. We're talking about theological borders, lines drawn not on maps, but on hearts and minds. And once belief becomes identity, compromise becomes heresy. Let's zoom out for a moment, because theology wasn't the only force pulling the church apart. Just as important was the question of authority. Who's in charge? And perhaps more importantly, who gets to say they're in charge? In the West, Rome was on the rise. The Bishop of Rome, known as the Pope, began asserting something bold, that he had universal jurisdiction over all of Christendom. Not just moral influence, but legal authority. Over bishops, over churches, over doctrine. And the justification? Apostolic succession. Rome claimed it had inherited its authority directly from Peter, the rock upon which Christ said he would build his church. But in the East, that claim didn't go down so easily. Constantinople, and the other patriarchates in the East, weren't just going to roll over and take orders from Rome. They had their own traditions, their own councils, and their own understanding of how the church should be governed. They favored a conciliar model. Leadership by council, not monarchy. Authority shared, not centralized. They didn't reject Rome's importance, but they pushed back against Rome's supremacy. And then came a warning shot, the Great Schism. In the 9th century, long before the final split of 1054, there was already a major blow-up. A controversy involving Patriarch Photius of Constantinople challenged Rome's authority to interfere in Eastern appointments. It got ugly. Excommunications, political intrigue, all the ingredients of a slow-burning crisis. The Filioque schism didn't cause the final break, but it exposed the cracks. It revealed just how deep the tension ran, not only over ideas, but over control. Because behind every theological dispute was a deeper battle: who decides what Christianity is? And now, we arrive at the breaking point. The year is 1054. After centuries of simmering tension, political maneuvering, theological disputes, and growing mistrust, the fragile relationship between East and West finally shatters. It begins with an exchange that's anything but holy. Pope Leo IX sends his legates, envoys representing papal authority, to Constantinople. They're supposed to negotiate. Instead, they escalate. The legates march right into the Hagia Sophia, the heart of Eastern Christianity, and slam a formal decree of excommunication onto the altar. They accuse the Patriarch, Michael Cerularius, of heresy and overreach. Cerularius doesn't flinch. He responds in kind, excommunicating the legates. It's not just a political spat, it's a declaration: the bond is broken. And it wasn't just religious pride driving this rupture, it was politics. The Byzantine Empire was under pressure. External threats were closing in, particularly from the Normans. And Constantinople needed unity, not interference. So when the West came knocking with demands, the East saw it not as an invitation to dialogue, but as a threat to sovereignty. And let's be honest, the legates didn't exactly handle things diplomatically. Their behavior was aggressive. They disregarded protocol. They acted like conquerors, not envoys. And in doing so, they turned a tense disagreement into a permanent divide. This was the moment when centuries of friction finally sparked a fire that couldn't be put out. The excommunications of 1054 didn't just end a conversation. They symbolized a deeper truth. Two different churches had emerged, and neither was willing to bow to the other. So, what happens after a millennium-long relationship ends in excommunication? You don't just go your separate ways, you build separate worlds. In the West, the Roman Catholic Church became a centralized, hierarchical institution led by the Pope, with a tight grip on doctrine, discipline, and eventually, entire kingdoms. Latin remained the sacred language, and theological innovation continued through scholasticism, culminating in thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. The Church became not just a religious force, but a political one, crowning emperors, levying taxes, and steering wars. In the East, the Orthodox Church developed differently. It emphasized mysticism over legalism, tradition over innovation. Authority was distributed among patriarchs, not centralized in one office. Greek remained the primary liturgical language, and icons, not just as art, but as windows into the divine, defined worship. It was less about rules and more about experience, less about control and more about contemplation. But these weren't just spiritual differences, they were civilizational ones. The split reshaped diplomacy, economics, and even military alliances. During the Crusades, Latin and Greek Christians were supposed to be allies. But by the Fourth Crusade in 1204, Western armies didn't just pass through Constantinople, they sacked it. Yes, Christian crusaders plundered the greatest Christian city in the East. It was a betrayal so deep, many in the East never truly forgave it. From that point on, the gulf wasn't just theological, it was cultural, emotional, historical. Generations grew up on opposite sides of this fracture, each side convinced the other had lost its way. Two churches, two empires, two ways of understanding God, truth, and the world. And the longer they walked separate paths, the harder it became to imagine reunion. You might think a 1,000-year-old schism would fade into the background of history. But here's the twist, it never really went away. Fast forward to the 20th century. In the wake of world wars and global upheaval, something surprising happened. The Catholic and Orthodox churches started talking again. In 1965, something truly historic occurred. Both sides officially lifted the mutual excommunications of 1054. Not reversed, but lifted. It was a symbolic gesture, but it meant a lot. For the first time in centuries, leaders on both sides were saying, maybe we can heal this. And that kicked off the ecumenical movement. Dialogue, shared services, mutual respect, even theological cooperation. Popes and patriarchs exchanged visits, issued joint statements, and began inching, very slowly, toward reconciliation. But just as momentum seemed to build, the ground shifted again. In the 21st century, scandal began to shake the very foundations of trust in the Catholic Church. Waves of abuse revelations, systemic cover-ups, a growing sense among many believers that the institution wasn't just flawed, it was failing. The centralized hierarchy that once promised unity now seemed like a fortress of silence and denial. Meanwhile, the Orthodox Church wasn't without its own struggles, nationalism, political entanglements, internal power plays. But it didn't face the same global reckoning. And for many disillusioned Catholics, orthodoxy started to look appealing, traditional, mysterious, uncorrupted. So where does that leave us? In a world that's supposedly post-Christian, these ancient divisions still echo, not just in doctrine, but in people's spiritual journeys, in how communities choose to worship, in how we understand truth, leadership, and sacred trust. And in an age of growing skepticism, maybe the question isn't whether the churches will reunite. Maybe it's whether people still believe any church can be trusted at all. So now we come to the end, but not just the end of a story, the end of a question. What happens when power and faith become inseparable? The Great Schism wasn't just a historical accident. It was the unraveling of a centralized religious system that couldn't hold together under the weight of human pride, cultural divergence, and political ambition. But it also reveals something deeper, something that still speaks to us today. The more tightly you try to control faith, the more brittle it becomes. When belief is mandated from the top down, when creeds are edited without consensus, when hierarchy stifles humility, fractures are inevitable. But look closely, and you'll see something beautiful too. Even after the split, both East and West preserved rich spiritual traditions. People continued to seek truth, worship with reverence, and pursue the divine, not because they were forced to, but because they were drawn to it. In that way, the schism wasn't just a tragedy. It was also a reminder. Sometimes, truth survives better when it's decentralized. Sometimes, the spirit moves more freely outside of man-made institutions. Sometimes, it's in the quiet defiance of conscience where real redemption begins. So ask yourself, when it comes to faith, who should decide what's true? A council? A pope? A patriarch? Or the believer standing humbly before God? That's the real legacy of the Great Schism, and it's still unfolding. Thanks for watching. If you found this episode thought-provoking, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more history that challenges what you thought you knew. You can also check out the podcast version of this episode using the link in the description. And if you enjoy content that blends historical honesty with intellectual curiosity, don't stop here. There are plenty more stories waiting for you right here on Truth Behind History.